Hey there, neighbors. Just a quick request before we jump into the episode. I've been posting a lot more short form content on places like Instagram and TikTok, and then reposting that stuff to places like Threads and X and Facebook. So if you would, go to the podcast website, www.neighborontheleft.com, and in the contact section, all the social media links are there. Stop on over and check out some of the short form content. It tends to be a bit more lighthearted, at least some of it, more comedic than the heavy podcast episodes. But I would love to have you stop by, and if you'd be so kind to like and follow what you see. Thank you very much. And on to the episode. Okay, so you guys all know who E. Jean Carroll is, right? E. Jean Carroll took Donald Trump to court and won twice. And now, in his second administration, we find out that the Justice Department is now investigating her. And that tidbit isn't a footnote. That is a smoke alarm. And the thing about a smoke alarm is it does not explain the whole fire. It does not tell you which wall it started in. It doesn't, hand you a legal brief and 3 exhibits and a color-coded chart. It just screams because something is wrong. And something is wrong. Because this administration has gotten in the habit of naming the opposite of what it does. It claims it restored free speech, all the while raging at comedians and protesters and universities and journalists, late night hosts, anyone who uses the First Amendment without checking with Donald Trump first to see if he's in the mood. It says law and order while treating January 6th like a misunderstood field trip with bear spray. It says fiscal conservatism while ballooning the deficit and feeding the national debt, like a raccoon that gets into your garbage. It says it's fighting fraud and corruption while handing out pardons and political favors that make the claim sound less like a principle and more like a costume. And now it wants us to believe that it is ending the weaponization of justice. Right. Because apparently the way you end weaponization of justice is by putting the Justice Department on a guided tour through Donald Trump's personal grievance museum. Here is the woman who beat him in court. Here is the prosecutor who went after his business. Here is the former FBI director from the Russia investigation. Here is the impeachment guy. Here is the former insider who wrote the book. Here is the immigrant whose case embarrassed the administration. Different people, different facts, different legal theories, different caveats, but the same question keeps walking into the room. Is this really justice? Or is this revenge with, a .gov email address? And before anyone starts warming up the world's smallest violin for Donald Trump, let's be clear, nobody is above the law. Not Trump, not Democrats, not prosecutors, not accusers, not senators, not former officials. Nobody is supposed to be above the law. If someone commits a crime, that can be investigated. But equal justice does not mean the law technically exists on paper. It means the law is not aimed like a weapon at the people who embarrass the president. It means prosecutors do not become political attack dogs. It means the Justice Department doesn't become, the customer service desk where Donald Trump gets to lodge all his grudges. And that is why the E. Jean Carroll story matters so much, because Carroll is not just another person under federal scrutiny. She is one of the few people who successfully held Trump legally accountable in court. She won a $5 million verdict. Then she won an $83.3 million verdict. And now, Trump is back in the White House. His Justice Department is now looking at her. Now, that doesn't automatically prove retaliation, but it absolutely raises the question. And today we're going to ask that question carefully. Not from 30,000 feet, not with vague talk about norms and concerns and institutions until, I make all of your eyes glaze over. I want to talk about specifics. I want to talk about E. Jean Carroll, Letitia James, James Comey, Adam Schiff, John Bolton, and Kilmar Abrego Garcia. What happened? Why these people? Why now? What is the legal theory? What is the political context? And why does each case belong in a conversation about weaponized justice? Because the Justice Department is supposed to represent the United States, not the president's hurt feelings, not his old grudges, not his campaign slogans. And if the same administration that claims to be ending weaponized justice keeps finding reasons to investigate the people who sued Trump, prosecuted Trump, exposed Trump, embarrassed Trump, or just plain refused to bow to Trump, then maybe the problem is not that justice was weaponized before. Maybe the problem is that Donald Trump looked at that weapon and said, finally, my turn. Hello, neighbors, and welcome to a Friday edition of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. This is the podcast where we talk about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we are going to be talking about the weaponization of justice. And this is going to be a long one, so before I get off on any kind of a tangent, I'm going to jump right in here. Before we get into the individual cases, we need to clean up the word a little bit, weaponization, because this is one of those political terms that has been dragged through so many hearings and campaign speeches and fundraising emails and cable news panels and social media posts that it starts to get blurry. It starts to lose its shape. Everybody says it. Everybody accuses everybody else of doing it. And eventually people get tired and say, fine, whatever. Everybody weaponizes everything. Which I think is exactly how people abusing power want you to feel. Exhausted and cynical. Too worn out to make distinctions. So let's make the distinction. Weaponization of justice does not mean a political person gets investigated. It does not mean a famous person gets indicted. It does not mean someone with money or power or a television audience has to answer hard questions. Sometimes powerful people commit crimes. Sometimes politicians lie. Sometimes public officials abuse power. Sometimes prosecutors are right to investigate people who happen to be politically connected. So no, the argument tide is not that Donald Trump's enemies are automatically innocent. E. Jean Carroll is not above the law. Letitia James is not above the law. Neither is James Comey, Adam Schiff, John Bolton. Nobody gets a legal force field because they oppose Donald Trump. That's absurd. The argument is that the law cannot become a fishing pole dropped only into the pond where Donald Trump's enemies swim. That is where the danger begins. Weaponization happens when legal power is selectively aimed at enemies. Critics, rivals, accusers, prosecutors, investigators, inconvenient people in a way that looks less like neutral law enforcement and more like punishment. It happens when the question stops being, was there a crime here that requires prosecution, and starts sounding more like, can we find something on this person? Those are very different questions. Because if the government wants to look hard enough, it can make life miserable for almost anybody. Think about your own life for a second. Tax forms and mortgage documents and old emails and text messages, things you've said in public, work records, applications, depositions, if you've ever been involved in a lawsuit, financial paperwork, social media posts from years and years and years ago when everyone apparently thought punctuation was optional. Most people have some messy corner of their paper trail. That does not mean they are criminals. It means the government has enormous power if it decides to aim the microscope at you. That's why selection matters, timing matters, pressure matters. Who pushed for the investigation is important. The legal theory is important. And patterns, of course, patterns. Patterns are super important. So the questions for today are simple. Why this person? Why this allegation? Why now? And who pushed for it? Are similar cases being pursued against Trump's allies with the same energy? Are similar facts being treated similarly? Are we watching a system where loyalty gets you mercy and opposition gets you a subpoena? That is the whole issue in the nutshell. And let's also be honest about something. The American justice system has never been some spotless marble temple where, fairness floats down from the ceiling in a beam of light. Poor people know that. Black and brown communities know that. Immigrants know that. Protesters know that. Anyone who has ever looked at cash bail, overcharging, police misconduct, public defender work overload, or sentencing disparities knows that equal justice under the law has often been more of an aspiration than it has been a reality. So when Trump and his allies suddenly discovered the phrase weaponized justice, it felt a little rich. These are not people who spend decades worried about the poor kid railroaded by the system. They were not losing sleep over asylum seekers, overcharged defendants, or, people sitting in jail because they had no way to afford bail. Their concern about weaponized justice seems to activate at the exact moment accountability got too close to the Oval Office, at least while Trump is sitting in the Oval Office. It's funny how that works. Like some sort of weird motion sensor light that only turns on when you get near the president. But even if their use of the phrase is cynical, the concept itself is real. A government really can weaponize justice. A president really can pressure prosecutors. Investigations really can be used to chill speech and punish dissent and reward people who are loyal and, to send messages. And that's why I think this is so important, because the power of the Justice Department is not theoretical. When the DOJ investigates you, your life changes. Even if you're never charged. You hire lawyers, expensive lawyers, not found a coupon in the penny saver lawyers if you're smart. Federal defense lawyers who bill like they are charging by the syllable. Your name gets attached to phrases like criminal probe and federal investigation and possible charges. Your family worries, your friends all get suddenly very careful, your enemies start to celebrate. People who only read headlines decide they already know what happened. And maybe, 2 years later, the case ends up going nowhere. Maybe the judge throws it out, or the prosecutors decide not to push forward. Maybe you win, but you do not get back that time. You do not get the money back that you spent, and you don't get the peace back that you lost in the process. That is what people mean when they say the process can become the punishment. A conviction is not always necessary. Sometimes the punishment is, the cloud. It's the headline. Sometimes the punishment is the example made of you, so the next person thinks twice about whatever. And that is chilling. That is what I want to watch for in these cases. Not whether every person involved is likable, not whether every case is identical. They're not. Carol's situation is very different from that of Letitia James, and hers is different from Comey's, and Comey's is different from Schiff, and so on and so on. Different facts, different legal theories, different, details. And I want to treat them that way. Because if we flatten everything into one giant blob called, Trump bad, we actually weaken the argument. And to be clear, I am personally very comfortable with the sentence, Trump is bad. If you've listened to me at all, you know that I am not auditioning for a Sunday show panel where I have to pretend the truth lives exactly halfway between reality and whatever, Stephen Miller's opinion of the day is. I do not like this administration. I do not trust this administration. I think Trumpism is authoritarian in instinct, corrupt in practice, and allergic to accountability in a way that should worry everybody. Everybody who still has a pulse. But that doesn't mean that I want to be sloppy either. Actually, it sort of means the opposite. If the accusation is serious, then I want to approach it seriously. So, today when we talk about weaponization, we're going to separate what is confirmed from what is alleged. We're going to distinguish between suspicious optics, public criticism, judicial findings, indictments, investigations, unresolved allegations, because facts matter most when people in power are trying to make facts feel optional. And the first case, E. Jean Carroll, sits right at the center of the danger, because when a president's Justice Department starts looking at someone who beat the president in court, the issue is not just one deposition answer. The issue is whether the law is being applied neutrally, or whether the most powerful law enforcement apparatus in the country has started circling the president's old wounds and looking for payback. So let's start with E. Jean Carroll. And the first thing to understand is that Carroll is not just some random Trump critic who popped up on television, said something mean and then wandered into the news cycle. She is one of the few people who took Donald Trump to court and won twice. Carroll accused Trump of sexually assaulting her in a dressing room at Bergdorf Goodman in Manhattan in the 1990s. Trump denied it. Then he attacked her. He mocked her. He said she made it up. He did what he does when confronted with accountability: deny, insult, counterattack, and then act like the counterattack is actually proof of his innocence. But she didn't just tell her story, she sued. And in 2023, a federal jury found Trump liable for sexually abusing Carroll and then defaming her. The jury did not find him liable for rape under New York law, and that distinction matters, but it did find him liable for sexual abuse and defamation and awarded Carroll $5 million. Then in 2024, another jury awarded Carroll $83.3 million in a separate defamation case because Trump continued attacking her. So that is the background. This is not vibes. This is actually what happened. Courtroom evidence, jury's verdicts. And that is why the new DOJ investigation lands with such a thud. According to the reporting, the Justice Department has opened a criminal perjury investigation into Carroll. The issue appears to center on her testimony in 2022 in a deposition about whether anyone else was helping pay for her legal case. Carroll said no. Later, it became public that some of her legal expenses had been supported by a nonprofit connected to Reid Hoffman, the LinkedIn co-founder and Democratic donor. That is the legal hook right there. And I want to be careful here. Perjury is serious. Depositions matter. If someone knowingly lies under oath about a material issue, that can be a real crime. We do not have to pretend otherwise just because it's Trump who's, involved. But context does not disappear because someone says perjury. The president of the United States is Donald Trump, and the person reportedly being investigated is E. Jean Carroll. And E. Jean Carroll is the woman who beat him in court, cost him millions of dollars, which he's yet to pay, and became a living reminder that Trump can, in fact, be held accountable by ordinary legal processes. And it matters because when a president's Justice Department investigates one of that president's personal legal adversaries, the public has every right to ask hard questions. Who pushed for this? Why now? What changed, if anything? Would this be a federal criminal priority if Carroll had not beaten Trump in court? And that's the part I'm a bit hung up on here. If we were talking about some random woman who sued some random man and won, with the circumstances being the same, would the DOJ have any interest in it whatsoever if she lied in a deposition? And remember, we're not talking about, they're not accusing her of lying about anything substantive as far as the details of the case go. She supposedly lied about who, if anyone, was helping her pay for her legal bills. But yes, would this be something the DOJ would be focused on if the names were different? Are there similar deposition issues pursued with this kind of energy when the person involved is not, inside the president's current, hall of grudges? Those questions are not conspiracy theories. They are the basic questions you ask when the power of the federal government starts moving towards someone the president has a direct personal reason to punish. Now, there are details here that matter. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche reportedly recused himself because he previously represented Trump in Carroll-related litigation. Good. That is the right move for a change, but a recusal does not magically clean the air. It does not erase the conflict from the public mind, and it does not tell us whether the case would exist in the first place if Carroll's last name were not attached to two humiliating Trump losses. And that is the danger. Not that every investigation is automatically fake, not that, Carroll somehow deserves immunity, but that the Justice Department may be seen reasonably as revisiting the president's personal defeats. The civil courts already heard Trump's arguments about Carroll. His lawyers raised questions about the funding. They argued, they appealed, and they lost. The $5 million verdict survived. The defamation verdict still sits there as one of the most visible legal rebukes that Trump has ever faced. So now when the criminal justice system circles back around to Carroll, it feels less like a neutral search for truth and more like someone saying, fine, we couldn't beat her there. Let's try over here. Maybe prosecutors will decide there is no case. Maybe nothing comes of it. Maybe no charges are filed. That would matter, but the damage does not wait for the ending. The headline already exists. DOJ investigates E. Jean Carroll. That headline does a lot of work all by itself. It gives Trump allies something to wave around. It gives right-wing media a new toy to play with. It lets people who never accepted the jury's verdict in the first place say, see, she's the one under investigation now. Never mind that being investigated is not the same thing as being guilty. Never mind that there are issues unresolved and that, civil verdicts still happened. The cloud that it creates is the point. And that is why this belongs in the conversation about weaponized justice. Weaponization is not always about winning a conviction. Sometimes it's about placing that cloud over someone. The message is simple. You may win, but we may not be done with you. And this, especially for women who accuse powerful men, especially for witnesses, especially for private citizens who don't have endless resources and institutional protection, especially for anyone watching this whole story and thinking, if she can win in court and still end up under the microscope, what does that mean for the rest of us? That, those are the human stakes here. And again, the fair caveat matters. If there is real evidence of a knowing material lie under oath, prosecutors can look at it. Nobody gets a shield because they're, anti-Trump. But fairness also means recognizing when the government's target is not just legally relevant, but politically radioactive. So Carol gives us the first category in this episode: people who beat or wounded Trump in court. And that brings us to the next case, because Carol did it as a private citizen. Letitia James did it as an attorney general. And if Carol forced Trump to face a jury, James forced his business empire to face the evidence. And again, the question is not simply, can a Democrat be investigated? Of course. The question is whether the legal system is being used evenly, or whether it's being aimed at people who made Donald Trump bleed either politically, financially, or personally. Letitia James is the New York Attorney General who brought the civil fraud case against Trump, the Trump Organization, and others. That case alleged that Trump and his company inflated asset values to get better terms from banks and insurers. In other words, James did not just go after Trump as a politician. She went after the foundation of the whole Trump myth, his business genius, the empire, the golden letters, the idea that every building with his name on was proof that he was smarter and richer than everyone else. That is sacred territory for Donald Trump. You can criticize a policy and he'll rage. You can criticize, a statement he makes and he will rage, but question the business empire and now you're touching the Ark of the Covenant. It's not a place that you're allowed to go. James's case resulted in a massive civil judgment against Trump. Appeals and legal fights have continued, but the political wound was immediate. She became one of the public faces of Trump accountability. And Trump, as always, did not hide his anger. He attacked her repeatedly. He portrayed her as corrupt and political. He called for consequences. House Judiciary Democrats later pointed to public Trump statements where he said that James should be prosecuted, arrested, and punished. Now, can we all agree that that matters? Because when Trump returns to power and Letitia James is then faced with federal mortgage-related charges under Trump's Justice Department, the timeline stops feeling random. It feels like a story with a very loud prologue. The federal case against James involved allegations tied to property in Norfolk, Virginia. Prosecutors charged her with bank fraud and making false statements to a financial institution. They are alleging that she misrepresented the property in connection with a mortgage. And again, we're being honest, mortgage fraud is real. False statements to banks can be real. Public officials do not get immunity from financial crimes because they are public figures. But here's where the weaponization question comes in. Why this case? Why this target? Why now? And would this have become a federal priority if Letitia James had not been one of Trump's most visible legal enemies? Those questions only get louder when you look at how the case unfolded. The original case was dismissed without prejudice over a problem with the prosecutor's authority. That does not mean that James was declared innocent. It means the government could potentially try it again. But When prosecutors reportedly tried to bring a new indictment, a grand jury declined. And grand juries are not usually famous for saying no to prosecutors. So when a case against one of Trump's most hated legal adversaries runs into that kind of trouble, the public is allowed to ask whether the case was as strong as the politics were satisfying. And there's another layer to this, too. Reporting showed that the Justice Department also sought information related to James's earlier cases, including the civil fraud case against Trump. A federal judge blocked some DOJ demands after finding issue with the acting prosecutor that was appointed. Again, none of this automatically proves retaliation. It just paints a picture. Trump publicly wanted James punished. James wounded him legally and financially, and then Trump ended up back in the White House. His Justice Department is now pursuing her. The case encounters serious procedural and grand jury issues. This is in this episode because it shows how weaponization can work through ordinary-looking legal tools. It does not always arrive with someone saying, "Today we begin the revenge." It arrives as a referral or a subpoena, a mortgage allegation, a technical charge, a press release written in the flat language of law enforcement while the political context is standing in the corner, just winking and waving. And James's case raises one of the most important questions in the whole episode. Is the government chasing crimes or is it chasing people? In a healthy justice system, prosecutors start with evidence that a crime has been committed, and then they follow that evidence to the person responsible. In a weaponized system, the powerful start with a person. They want this person punished, and then they go hunting for a reason. So we'll put Letitia James sort of in the same category as Carol, but with a different angle. Carol's is the private citizen who beat Trump in court. James is the state's attorney who attacked the Trump business myth and won a major civil judgment. But the commonality, of course, is that people who made Trump answer to the law are now being made to answer to his Justice Department. And the optics of that should concern people, not because anyone deserves special attention, but because democracy deserves special attention. And democracy can't function if every prosecutor, attorney general, witness, accuser, plaintiff, whatever, has to wonder whether they're holding a president accountable today means becoming a federal target tomorrow. And that is why Letitia James is not a side note in this conversation. She is part of the architecture. Now, Carol and James both represent people who beat or harmed Trump through the courts, but the next case takes us into a different area of Trump's grievance universe. The Russia investigation, the FBI, the whole deep state mythology. And this is where we start to talk about James Comey. And this one is different from Carol and James. Comey did not sue Trump. He did not bring a civil fraud case against Trump's businesses. He represents something else in Trump's political imagination. He represents the FBI and the Russia investigation era. He represents what Trump and his allies spent years calling the deep state. Comey was the FBI director Trump fired in 2017. He became one of the central figures in Trump's story of persecution. That story had the story that every investigation into him was not law enforcement at all, not counterintelligence, not oversight, or it was a giant plot by shadowy enemies who hated his greatness and probably, drank fair trade coffee while doing it. Trump has attacked Comey for years. So when Comey gets pulled into the machinery of Trump's second-term Justice Department, the political context isn't subtle. It's not hidden in the bushes wearing camouflage. It's standing right in the middle of the road, and it's holding a sign. The specific recent issue involving Comey is bizarre. though, and I mean bizarre. The Justice Department has pursued charges tied to a social media post from Comey showing seashells arranged to read 8647. Of course, Trump is the 47th president, and 86 means to get rid of something. The claim is that it's common knowledge that the 86 is used more darkly by many people. Prosecutors have treated the post as a threat against Trump. Comey, for his part, deleted the post and denied intending anything remotely like violence. Now, again, for clarity, threats against the president are serious. Political violence is serious. We do not minimize actual threats, especially in a country where political extremism already, it has been ramped up so much. If someone truly threatens to harm a president, that can and should be criminal. But the law also has to distinguish between a true threat and an ambiguous political speech. That distinction matters a lot because the First Amendment matters, context matters, intent, meaning. And this is where the Comey case gets dangerous because we're talking about a cryptic social media post with seashells by one of Trump's oldest public enemies. That does not mean Comey's post was smart. You could argue very successfully that it wasn't. If you're a former FBI director and one of the most hated figures in Trump world, maybe you do not communicate in, beach riddles or whatever about the sitting president. That is not exactly, elite crisis management. But dumb is not automatically criminal. Bad judgment is not automatically a felony. Ambiguous speech is not automatically a true threat because the person interpreting it already hates the speaker. That's the concern. If a Trump ally says something violent or reckless, suddenly we're all asked to understand the context. It was a joke. It was a meme. It was a metaphor. It was heat of the moment. It was locker room, whatever. But if James Comey posts 8647 in seashells, the Justice Department turns into, Sherlock Holmes all of a sudden. That is not equal justice. That is selective translation at best. And there's another reported Comey matter too, involving charges connected to statements to Congress. That case also came in the context of Trump politically demanding action against political enemies. And again, that matters. A prosecution that follows a president's public demand for charges against a named enemy does not automatically prove retaliation, but it absolutely raises the bar for trust. The president should not be able to yell, do something, and then watch the Justice Department go, fetch a case out of thin air because of who the person is. That is not independence of the DOJ. That's service. And the Comey case belongs in this episode because it shows how weaponization can move into the realm of speech. Carol is a personal legal humiliation. Letitia James is a state-level legal accountability. Comey is the original law enforcement wound. He is part of the grievance mythology that Trump has been feeding to his base since the Russian investigation began. The idea that everyone who investigated him was corrupt, everyone who questioned him was a criminal, and every official who touched his misconduct should, eventually be punished. And then Trump returns to power. He creates permission to treat former investigators as targets. Now, James Comey is not above the law. Former FBI directors can commit crimes. If prosecutors have strong evidence of an actual criminal threat or knowingly false statements, they can bring that evidence into court. But weak or strained cases against political enemies are not harmless. We cannot separate this case from Trump's years of political hostility towards Comey. The concern is not that Comey is a hero. Many Democrats have their own complaints about Comey. And some of those complaints are very valid. The concern is that a president's longtime enemy is now facing criminal charges under that president's Justice Department, including one involving ambiguous speech that legal experts have already questioned. So yes, this one also belongs in the conversation about weaponized justice, because if the law becomes a tool for turning old political anger into new criminal exposure, then every investigator, every prosecutor, whistleblower, inspector general, whatever, are going to get a message. You do your job today, and if Donald Trump does not like it, he may spend the next decade calling you a criminal. Then, if he has the option, he will try to make the paperwork match the insult. That's the danger. And that leads us directly to the next figure in Trump's grievance universe, Adam Schiff. If Comey represents the FBI and the Russia wound, Schiff represents Congress doing one of the things Congress is supposed to do when a president abuses power: oversight, investigation, impeachment. And now Schiff, too, has been pulled into the orbit of mortgage fraud scrutiny. Different facts, but the same question. Is this neutral law enforcement? So if James Comey lives in Trump's Russia investigation grievance file, Adam Schiff lives in the impeachment file. Schiff was one of the leading figures in the Trump in his first impeachment. He helped make the case that Trump abused power of the presidency by pressuring Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden while military aid was being held up. To Democrats, Schiff was doing oversight. To MAGA, he became a cartoon villain in a tailored suit. Trump, again, attacked him constantly. He gave him nicknames, he called him corrupt, he accused him of treason. Schiff became one of those names that in the MAGA-verse works less like a person and more like a starter pistol. Just say Adam Schiff and the outrage machine starts barking before it even knows why. So when Schiff later faces mortgage fraud scrutiny in Trump's second term, we have to understand the context. The allegation, broadly speaking, involves whether Schiff misrepresented a property as a primary residence in mortgage-related paperwork. Reporting has tied the scrutiny to a referral connected with Bill Pult, the Trump-appointed head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And that matters because this is where the weaponization starts to look bureaucratic. It's not always a dramatic indictment in front of flags. It's not always the attorney general walking into the room, going to the podium with the expression of someone about to, announce a major prosecution. Sometimes it just begins as a referral, a records review, a question about an old mortgage form. A federal official with access to housing-related information suddenly showing great interest in the paperwork of people who just happen to be some of Trump's most visible critics. That is why Schiff's story belongs here. Mortgage fraud is not imaginary. Adam Schiff does not qualify for some sort of immunity from scrutiny. But because Schiff is not being examined in a political vacuum, he is one of Trump's most hated congressional investigators, and the scrutiny of him fits alongside a broader cluster of these mortgage-related allegations involving Trump adversaries, including Letitia James and others. And that cluster is important. One mortgage inquiry into one Trump critic might not be an issue, but multiple mortgage-related referrals or investigations involving prominent Trump enemies starts to look like method. And again, we don't know where this is going to go ultimately. But, and if this case falls apart later, if the evidence is weak, if it turns out to be more complicated than the headline, that cloud has already done what clouds do. That is why the selection matters so much. Are these the strongest mortgage fraud cases in America? Are there similar cases involving Trump allies being referred with the same enthusiasm? Are federal housing records being used even-handedly? Or is the government rummaging through paperwork of Trump's enemies and calling that anti-corruption? And that last possibility should disturb you. Because once the federal government starts using its access, to its information and using it selectively, the danger spreads beyond people like Adam Schiff. It tells public officials and prosecutors and regulators, whoever, that every form they ever signed may become a weapon if they anger the president. And again, that does not mean every allegation is false. This is where the caveat matters. If Adam Schiff knowingly lied on his mortgage documents, then they should be investigating him. Nobody should get a pass because they are on the correct side of my particular politics. And, Schiff was not just a critic. He was part of a constitutional accountability process. Impeachment is not some exotic deep state ritual performed, under a full moon. It's one of the tools the Constitution gives Congress to check a president. And Trump has spent years trying to rebrand that lawful oversight as treason. It is not just about one senator and one mortgage question. It is about whether the people who used lawful tools to investigate Trump are now being made examples of under Trump's restored power. The next time a member of Congress has to investigate presidential misconduct, what are they supposed to think? The next time a committee lawyer or staffer or witness, whistleblower, whatever, considers stepping forward, what are they supposed to remember? Adam Schiff became a legal federal target. So did Letitia James and James Comey and E. Jean Carroll. And these stories are not identical. That's not the point. The point is that the direction keeps looking familiar toward people who helped hold Trump accountable. That's why I think this list is more than just a list of disconnected legal stories. It's a map. Schiff shows us how the revenge machine can move through the dullest parts of government, records and referrals and financial forms and agency heads. But the boring part is the camouflage. Nobody storms the Capitol with a mortgage. A mortgage form in the wrong hands aimed at the right enemy can still become a weapon. So now, for yet another different sort of case here, we'll talk about John Bolton. John Bolton doesn't fit into the category exactly like any of these other folks because John Bolton worked for Trump. He was inside the building. He saw Trump close up, and then he turned on him. And when someone from inside the house becomes a critic, Trump tends to treat that not as disagreement, but as betrayal. So now we'll talk about John Bolton, and this one needs care because the allegations involve national defense information. Classified information cases are serious by their nature, but the weaponization question still follows us. And I want to say up front about John Bolton, I'm not here to make John Bolton seem cuddly. That is not my intent. It is not my job. This is not part of the episode where we dim the lights, bring the children's choir, and pretend John Bolton has spent his career gently, bottle feeding orphan doves. John Bolton is, for lack of a better way to say it, John Bolton. He's a hardline conservative foreign policy figure. He has supported aggressive uses of American power. He has been one of the most hawkish voices in modern Republican politics. Plenty of people on the left have very strong feelings about him, and many of those feelings come with footnotes and elevated blood pressure. So this is not a sainthood ceremony. But principles matter most when they apply to people you don't like. And Bolton belongs in this category because he represents a different category of Trump enemy, the insider who turned. Bolton served as Trump's national security advisor. He was in the room, he saw the administration close up, and then he left and became a critic and wrote a book that painted Trump as dangerously self-interested, uninformed, and transactional where foreign policy was concerned. And that in and of itself made him more than an opponent. In Trump world, that made him a traitor. Not legally, but emotionally. Trump does not tend to process criticism from former officials and as disagreement or whistleblowing or public service. He processes it as betrayal. You were inside the castle, you saw the king without the crown, and then you told people what you saw. And for Trump, that's unforgivable. The legal issue involving Bolton is serious. The Justice Department charged him over national defense and information allegations, including counts related to transmitting and retaining sensitive information. Prosecutors allege that Bolton shared diary-like notes from his time as National Security Advisor with unauthorized people. And that's not nothing. Classified information matters. National defense information matters. If a former senior national security official mishandled sensitive material, that is a real legal issue and deserves serious treatment. So maybe the caveat here needs to be stronger than in some of the other examples. This is not a seashell post. It's not an old mortgage form. This involves national security information, and we should not wave that away just because Bolton became a Trump critic. But the question is not whether classified information laws are real. They are, of course. The question is whether they are being applied consistently or whether Trump's former enemies and defectors are getting a level of scrutiny that allies and loyalists just don't get. That is where Bolton belongs in the weaponization conversation. He is not just a former official accused of mishandling information. He is a former Trump insider who publicly embarrassed Trump. He became, a witness against the myth of Trump competence. And Trump hated that. So when Bolton later faces charges under Trump's, return Justice Department, the public is allowed to ask the same questions. Why this case and why now? Are similar cases being pursued against people aligned with Trump? Is the standard neutral, or is the law being applied with special intensity to people who broke with him? No matter how well Bolton served in the Trump White House, or no matter how much he decided he didn't like the way Trump did things, that does not mean Bolton gets to mishandle classified material. He does not. But it does mean the public should care whether the rules are being enforced evenly or politically. Because if the rules are real only for enemies, then they're not rules. They're just weapons. And that is why Bolton matters here. And last but not least, we have Kilmar Abrego Garcia. With these other cases, we are often talking about public criticism, suspicious timing, contested legal theories, the appearance of selective enforcement. But in the Garcia case, the concern about retaliation is not just a talking point from critics. A judge reportedly found vindictive prosecution. And that matters because vindictive prosecution is not a cable news insult. It's a legal warning sign. So let's talk about Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And this case is different. It seems to have much less gray area than some of the others. So as I said, a judge reportedly found vindictive prosecution, and that phrase matters because it's not just someone, on TV saying this feels gross. It's not a hashtag. It's a legal concept. It means the government is accused of prosecuting someone in retaliation for exercising a legal right. And if that is what happened, that cuts straight to the heart of the rule of law. The basic story is this. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was wrongly deported by the Trump administration despite legal protections that should have prevented it. His case became a major embarrassment for the administration because it exposed not just the cruelty, but the incompetence wrapped in cruelty, which is a Trump-era blend, like authoritarianism with, its shoelaces tied together. He challenged what happened. He fought back legally. And after that, the government brought a human smuggling case against him connected to an older traffic stop. That timing is what made the case so troubling because the allegation wasn't brand new. The underlying incident was not something that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It became a federal prosecution after Abrego Garcia's deportation case became public and a public and legal problem for the administration. And a judge reportedly dismissed the case as vindictive. That is why we're talking about it in this episode, because this is the mechanism we have been talking about all the while, but with the warning light flashing brighter. Someone embarrasses the administration, someone exercises legal rights, someone forces the government to answer for what it did, and then suddenly the government finds a criminal case to bring. And, that's not how it's supposed to work. If the government has evidence of a crime, it should pursue that evidence because the law requires it, not because the person, made the administration look bad. And, I'll say, just because we're being adults, a dismissal based on vindictive prosecution does not mean every fact in the government's allegation was necessarily false. It does not mean that Abrego Garcia is automatically perfect or incapable of wrongdoing. The legal issue is whether the prosecution itself was improperly motivated, whether the government brought the case as retaliation. If a court finds that the government acted vindictively, that isn't just bad optics anymore. That's not just, me, the liberal guy, saying, I don't like this. It's a flashing red siren. Because the justice system cannot punish people for using the justice system. That sentence should be obvious. It should be so obvious that we don't have to say it, but here we are, standing in the year of our Lord, 2026, surrounded by men who think due process is a brand of imported cheese or something. The government cannot say, you challenged us, so now we're going to make you pay. It cannot say, you embarrassed us, so now we're going to dig through your past. That's retaliation. And Abrego Garcia's case matters because it shows the stakes for people who are not famous. And that part's important too. Because it's easy to hear names, Carol and James and Comey and Schiff and Bolton and think, well, these are all public figures. They have lawyers, they have platforms, they have donors and supporters and press attention. People with, blue checks yelling at them on X. But Abrego Garcia reminds us that weaponized government power does not only threaten famous people, it threatens vulnerable people first. Immigrants, detainees, people without money, people without, microphones. That's how authoritarian power works. It tests itself on people who have fewer defenses, and then it expands. It learns what courts will tolerate. It learns what the public will ignore. It learns what, the media will conveniently forget by Tuesday. That is why Abrego Garcia belongs in this conversation, because the core question is not only whether Trump is settling scores with prominent enemies, it's whether the federal government is developing a habit of punishing defiance. And once punishment of defiance becomes normal, the category of targets always grows. Today, it's the woman who sued him. Today, it's the attorney general who prosecuted him. Today it's the FBI director he fired, or the impeachment manager, or the former insider who criticized him, or the immigrant whose case embarrassed him. But tomorrow, who's next? A journalist, a protester, a local official, a whistleblower, a judge, a school board member, a person who had the nerve to ask for the rights the Constitution says they already have. That's the danger. And before I wrap up, I want to talk about one more thing here, and that's the anti-weaponization hypocrisy. Because Trump and his allies did not just return to power saying we want revenge. They're not usually that honest. They returned saying they were going to end weaponized justice. They wrapped the whole thing in the language of reform. They said the government had been abused. They said law enforcement had been politicized. They said federal power had been turned against innocent people for partisan reasons. And look, as a general principle, that concern is not absurd. Government power can be abused. The FBI, DOJ, local police, federal agencies, all of them deserve scrutiny. Liberals should know that. Progressives should know that. Communities on the receiving end of government power have been telling America that for generations. But Trump's version of anti-weaponization is not a serious civil liberties project. It's not about protecting the vulnerable from state power. It's not about making the justice system more fair or more restrained or accountable or less political. It's about one thing: reclassifying accountability against Trump as abuse and retaliation by Trump as justice. Hard stop. That's it. When the law looks at Trump, it's weaponization. When the law looks at Trump's enemies, it's accountability. When Trump is investigated, the system is corrupt. When E. Jean Carroll is investigated, suddenly everyone is very concerned about deposition accuracy. When Trump's business empire is scrutinized, it's a witch hunt. When Letitia James' mortgage paperwork is scrutinized, it's law and order. When Trump's conduct towards Ukraine leads to impeachment, it's a coup. When Adam Schiff faces scrutiny, well, now we're just asking questions. When the FBI investigates Trump world, it is the deep state in action. When the Justice Department prosecutes Comey, that is apparently the deep state being healed with seashells. This is not consistency. This is not principle. This is moral plumbing that's installed backwards. And the phrase weaponization of justice becomes especially dangerous because it takes a real concern and turns it into a partisan permission slip. It tells Trump supporters that every action against Trump was legitimate and every action against his enemies is righteous. It turns revenge into restoration. It turns, payback into reform, grudges into governance. And moreover, that is how authoritarian movements launder retaliation. They don't say we're punishing dissent. They say we're restoring order. They don't say we're intimidating critics. They say we're holding people accountable. They don't say we're using state power to settle scores. They say we're ending corruption. And if you only listen to the label, it sounds fine. Who's against accountability? Who's against ending corruption or stopping abuses of power? But you cannot just read the label. You have to watch the hands. The hands keep reaching towards the same shelf, the shelf with Trump's enemies on it. And that is why contradiction matters. This administration says free speech while threatening speech it dislikes. It says fiscal conservatism while blowing holes in the budget. It says anti-corruption while rewarding allies, and anti-weaponization while appearing to aim legal power consistently at the people who held Trump accountable, embarrassed him, or refused to flatter him. The slogan and the behavior don't match. And when the slogan is justice, but the behavior looks like payback, we have a problem, much bigger than any one case. All right. So let's wrap this all up here. Why does this matter beyond these specific people? Because I can already hear the response from some corners saying, who cares about this? They're all powerful people. We're talking about 5 different cases. Carroll has lawyers, and James was an attorney general, and Comey ran the FBI, and Schiff was a senator, and Bolton worked at the highest levels of government. And yes, these people have resources. Some have platforms. Some have connections. Some have legal teams. Most of us could not afford if we sold everything we owned. But you're missing the point if you focus on that. The danger is not limited to the famous person in the headline. The danger is the message the headline sends to everyone else. Because if the Justice Department can be aimed at people with lawyers and platforms and public support, imagine what it can do to people without those things. Imagine the whistleblower inside the agency who sees something corrupt and wonders whether reporting it will make them a target. Or the local official who refuses to help carry out an abusive policy and then wonders whether some federal agency will suddenly become fascinated by their paperwork. Imagine the journalist deciding whether to publish a damaging story, or the protester deciding whether to show up, or, the witness deciding whether to testify, the woman deciding whether to accuse a powerful man. Imagine the immigrant deciding whether to challenge the government in court. Those are the effects of these cases. Chilling effects, and chilling effects don't require mass arrests. They don't require every critic to be prosecuted. They only require enough examples, enough headlines, enough legal bills, investigations, uncertainty, enough people watching someone else get dragged through the machinery and deciding quietly, privately, and understandably, I don't want to be next. That is how fear works in a democracy before it fully stops being one. It does not always begin with silence imposed by force. It sometimes begins with silence chosen for survival. And that is why the process as punishment matters so much. A failed prosecution can still punish. An investigation that ends without charges can still punish. Subpoenas, searches, headlines, a year of legal fees, the cloud over your name, they all punish. And for an administration built around grievance, that may be enough to satisfy their itch. Because the goal doesn't have to be conviction. The goal can be intimidation and humiliation and to rewrite the story. Sometimes the goal is to tell the next person, look what happened to them. Do you really want to try it? That is why we should not look at these cases as disconnected, legal curiosities. They are not all the same. They do not all carry the same weight. Some may have stronger evidence than others. Some may collapse. Some may proceed. Some may be legitimate in ways we can't fully evaluate from the outside yet. But taken together, they raise a democratic alarm. Not because every person on this list is pure. Not because every allegation is fake. But because the direction of government power matters. And right now, again and again, that power appears to be moving towards the people who challenged Trump. That is not normal. And we should stop calling abnormal things politics just because the people doing them have learned to smile in front of flags while they do them. The Justice Department is not supposed to be a mood ring for the president. It's not supposed to change color based on who hurt his feelings. It's supposed to represent the United States. Not the president personally, not his campaign or his movement or his revenge fantasies. The United States. And that means it has to be able to investigate crime without becoming a weapon. And it has to be able to ignore the president's anger when the president's anger is not evidence. That's the principle. Nobody is above the law, but the law is also not below the president. It does not sit at his feet waiting for instructions. It doesn't fetch, it doesn't heal. It doesn't turn his private humiliations into, public prosecutions just because, he says so. At least it's not supposed to. And that is the question hanging over all of this. Are we watching the Justice Department enforcing the law, or are we watching the government learning how to keep score? Because once justice has an enemies list, it's not justice anymore. It's just power. So here's the line. The Justice Department is supposed to pursue crime, not grudges. It's supposed to protect the rule of law, not the ego of Donald Trump. It's supposed to be blind, not squinting at an enemies list. And when the same system keeps finding legal theories against the same category of people, the people who beat Trump or investigated Trump or embarrassed Trump, we are not looking at a coincidence anymore. We're looking at a warning. A government that can aim justice at enemies can aim it anywhere. And once that becomes normal, the rest of us are not watching from the audience. We are waiting in the line. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this Friday installment of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. I'm very grateful that you did, and I'd love to hear from you. You can go to the website, neighborontheleft.com, go to the contacts page, and either using the social media platforms or the email address, you can reach out to the podcast with comments about this episode, questions, critiques, compliments, ideas, whatever it is that you might want to share. I'd like to hear it. While you're on the website, you can go to the episodes page and you can either stream or download any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And of course, there's the blog section that I mention every week. I do blog posts that mirror the topics from the podcast, and I include all of my sources on the blog posts for your review. Weekend is here. I'll be back on Monday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of weekend you'd wish for others.